Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Kim Maphis Early with the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. The Simmons Foundation sponsors this briefing, which is the 10th in our series of Hurricane Harvey funder briefings. In our past briefings, we've covered a number of topics relevant to disaster recovery and philanthropy. And we've also heard from funders who've made significant commitments to the rebuilding of those affected by the hurricane. We hope these briefings have assisted you as you've guided your own organizations in funding long-term recovery. Today, we'll be focusing on how philanthropic dollars flow following a disaster, and specifically about how funding is proceeding in Texas. All the prior briefings have been recorded, and you can find them archived along with a written summary at the Simmons Foundation website in their initiative area on Hurricane Harvey. Our written summary report will have active links to any of the resources that are mentioned today. We'll start today with some news about funding, and then we'll hear from our guests. And as is our practice in these briefings, we'll close with an opportunity for funders to share information about their work and ask questions of each other. We're hosting these briefings for you. We hope that your participation with news and questions moves the funding work forward for the recovery of all those who've been affected by Hurricane Harvey. You can submit a question to our speakers or to your fellow funders at any time using the Q&A box on your screen. Simply type your question and hit send. If you are interested to share the recovery work of your own foundation, click on the icon to raise your hand, and when that time in our briefing comes, I'll announce your name and turn your mic on. Wait a second for the sound to kick in, and then share the name of your philanthropic organization and any news you want us to know or questions you'd like for the group of funders to consider. We have a lot of updates to share today. First, the Council of Foundations is hosting a June 13th webinar on a new framework for measurement in the social sector. We share this because we think that the three parts that they're going to be covering, evaluation, monitoring, and feedback from your beneficiaries, might help you as you think about your own investments in disaster recovery. There's also another webinar on June 20th on ways that private foundations can use donor-advised funds to advance their missions. Rebuild Texas and Center for Disaster Philanthropy are teaming up to help dedicate $1 million to preparedness projects throughout the affected region of Hurricane Harvey. Applications for funding are due by June 15th, and decision notifications will be made by early July. And on the link on your screen and that will be in your summary report, you can click on that for a one-page description that will also link you to the applications. And then we have three announcements from the federal government. The Department of the Interior is offering water marketing strategy grants to states, Indian tribes, irrigation districts, water districts, and other organizations with water or power delivery authority located in the Western United States or the U.S. territories. For more information about this opportunity, you can click on this link. If you have beneficiaries or that or grantees that you think might also be eligible for these, or if you're in general public meetings that you think this information should be shared, please do that. In addition, the department is offering small-scale water efficiency grants in the same locations, and these would support small-scale water projects that have been prioritized through planning efforts that are led by the applicant. These projects are to conserve and use water more efficiently and to mitigate conflict risks in areas that have a high risk of future water conflict, and they also are attempt to accomplish other water benefits. Next up, the Community Forest and Open Space Conservation Program of the USDA is offering land grants to acquire and preserve forests that provide public access and recreational opportunities, protect water supplies and wildlife, service demonstration sites, or provide economic benefits from timber and non-timber products. You can find additional information at the link. And the Community Planning and Capacity Building Division of FEMA will also be announcing new information on Hurricane Harvey recovery opportunities. These announcements will come weekly, and if you have something to share, you can submit that news at this link. We're happy today to welcome Grace Sato. Grace is Knowledge Services Manager for Foundation Center and a frequent collaborator with CDP. CDP and Foundation Center partner to produce Measuring the State of Disaster Philanthropy, Data to Drive Decisions, a report that provides comprehensive data collection and analysis effort on disaster-focused charitable giving. The purpose of the report is to capture more accurately how philanthropy currently responds to disasters and to encourage the philanthropic community to support the full arc of a disaster, not just the immediate relief needs. We've asked Grace to share the highlights of that report. Thanks for being with us, Grace.
Thank you, Kim, for inviting me to participate on this webinar. We can go to the next slide. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Foundation Center, we are a nonprofit, and our mission is to strengthen the social sector by advancing knowledge about philanthropy. And one of the core ways we do that is through our database of foundation grants. So nonprofits can access this database through a tool called Foundation Directory online to identify potential funders, but we're also using this data for research purposes to inform the philanthropic sector about how foundation funding is distributed across the US and globally, which leads to our partnership with the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. We're in our 5th year of working together to track funding for disasters and humanitarian crises, and it's been a great partnership and an important one. Next slide. So we know that disasters happen with regularity. We might not know where or when it's going to take place, but we know that it will occur and that philanthropy will be responding. So through the Measuring the State of Disaster Philanthropy reports and tools, we're hoping to provide data to support effective disaster grant making by demonstrating where, how much, and how donors contribute to disasters. And we want this data to be used to help funders to make informed and effective funding decisions when it comes to disasters. This slide presents our disaster taxonomy for the project. And we're looking at a variety of disaster types, not just natural disasters. And that includes complex humanitarian emergencies and man-made accidents. We're particularly interested in the assistance strategies that are implemented, if foundations describe that at all. Beyond the immediate crisis, what are funders doing in the areas of resilience, risk reduction and mitigation, who's funding preparedness, and who's engaging in the longer-term reconstruction and recovery effort? So we do an annual analysis of funding from multiple data sources that includes foundations, corporations, bilateral and multilateral aid, FEMA data, and where it's available, we're also looking at donor-advised funds and online giving platforms like Network for Good and Global Giving. Next slide. So this image is taken from last year's report, which was based on 2015 data. So what are we able to say about foundation funding for disasters and humanitarian crises? The data here are based on Foundation Center's research set. So that's all grants of $10,000 or more reported by 1,000 of the largest US foundations. It's not comprehensive of all foundation funding, but it provides a glimpse at what the funding trends are. And you can see that almost half of the funding, 48%, went to natural disasters. Of this amount, epidemics captured the most grant dollars. Nearly all of this funding supported efforts related to the Ebola outbreak. You might remember that 2014 was the largest outbreak of Ebola in history, and so very large foundations like the Gates Foundation and Paul G. Allen Family Foundation poured enormous resources into the crisis that continued into 2015. It's worth noting that an additional $16.9 million went to earthquakes from 159 grants, and those were largely for the Nepal earthquake. Earthquakes received the highest number of foundation grants, which indicates that more foundations were engaged but investing smaller amounts in the Nepal earthquake compared with the Ebola crisis. And 17% was specifically targeted for complex humanitarian emergencies. This is not a lot, but it's actually a big increase from prior years, coinciding with the humanitarian crisis in Syria and growing public concern over the European migrant crisis. Next slide. I mentioned in our taxonomy slide that we're examining grants according to disaster assistance strategy. And in 2015, the largest proportion of foundation funding, that's 34%, went to response and relief efforts. This is actually a smaller proportion than in previous years. Like the year before, it was 74% for response and relief. And funding for resilience, risk reduction, and mitigation was 17%, which was an increase in funding from previous years also. To put that in context, in the previous 2 years, risk reduction and mitigation received about 9% of overall disaster funding. What we found specifically in 2015 was that some funders made these very large grants to strengthen disaster risk management after the Ebola outbreak. What we've consistently found is that preparedness and reconstruction and recovery are underfunded strategies. You can see that 6% of funding was for preparedness and 5% for reconstruction and recovery. Next slide. That's just some of the analysis from last year's report on foundation funding for disasters and humanitarian crises. You can download the PDF and also take a look at our online tools that allow users to interact with that data. The image on the left is a screenshot of our online dashboard, which provides the report data and the research analysis in kind of an aggregated way. And if you're interested in seeing details at the actual grant or disbursement level, we've also built a mapping platform that visualizes who's funding what and where it's going. And I'll spend a brief moment showing you a little bit about what you can find on that mapping platform. Next slide. The map contains data that we have, Foundation Center has, from 2011 to the present, and the data are refreshed monthly. So as we receive new information, we clean it and code it and add it to our database and upload it into the map. So you can search through the mapping platform in various ways. You'll see on top that there's a search function by location, disaster type, disaster assistance strategy, and we compare foundation data, philanthropy data, with other data sources like bilateral and multilateral aid that's reported from the OECD or FEMA. Next slide. You can also filter for data on this platform by keyword. So in the screenshot, we've done a search for Harvey in the keyword search. And when you click on the list view, you can go on to the next slide. You'll see everything in our database that relates to Harvey. So this is a list of the grants that are sorted by largest grant amount to smallest. In here we see that the largest grants are from the Bristol-Myers Squibb Company Contributions Program. Walmart has some grants, and so does Verizon. So one note that there is a difference between what you see here on the mapping platform from kind of the analysis of the trends that I was talking about earlier. The analysis is based on grants data that usually come from Foundation tax forms or that were reported directly to Foundation Center. These Harvey records, since they just came in over the last, within the last year, 6 to 9 months, they are reports that we've gotten through press releases, news stories, things like that during the time of the disaster and the 6 months following. So that's why you'll see that some recipients are labeled as unknown recipient or multiple recipients, and that's because when the announcement was made, there was no recipient that was mentioned, but there was a pledge that was nonetheless made for that disaster. Next slide. And you can drill down even further to see a more detailed description for that record. So for example, here, Walmart is recorded as giving $10 million to the American Red Cross to support shelters in areas affected by Hurricane Harvey. Next slide, please. So ultimately, we hope that this tool can help funders to better understand what others are doing in disaster philanthropy and identify opportunities to address funding gaps, to increase collaboration, and to make strategic decisions. We invite you to poke around disasterphilanthropy.foundationcenter.org. And if your foundation or company's disaster grants do not appear on the map, please let me know. One of the big limitations of our data is that we can only code based on the information that we have. And since it often comes from foundation tax returns, there isn't that much detail of grants on tax forms. And so one of the ways we get better data is by foundations and corporations directly reporting their grants data to us. So please send me an email at gms@foundationcenter.org if you are willing to share your grants data. And I think lastly, and the biggest takeaway from all of this research year after year is that it confirms what we probably intuitively know, is that the largest share of philanthropic dollars goes to the immediate need following a crisis. Few foundations contribute to mid or long-term recovery or funding for resilience or preparedness. And so in thinking about how your philanthropic dollars can fill existing gaps, one data-proven area of need is for strategic funding beyond the immediate crisis. And that's it. I'll turn it back over to you, Kim.
Thanks, Grace. One clarification question we have already to you is, and I could answer it, but I'd prefer you to, is it true then that the mapping platform is always more current than the general report?
Yes. The general report will always be 2 years behind, just because of how we're getting the foundation grants data. It takes time for the IRS to share that information. So the mapping platform will have what's current in our database. That's exactly right.
We have a second question here. Is there a common definition of resilience that's used by disaster funders?
That is a good question. I'm not aware of one. If there is one, maybe this is a good time to note like how we came up with this taxonomy. Before we started the project, we had a bunch of conversations with different funders and different experts in the disaster space to kind of see how they were thinking about their funding for disasters, and also just how the field of humanitarian aid kind of categorizes things. And so one of the reasons why we split up resilience from preparedness, I think sometimes they're sort of lumped together, but there were some funders who clearly thought that their disaster-related funding was not preparedness, but was resilience and risk reduction. And so we kind of have our own definition for how we bucket things. Of course, it's not, you know, different people can look at the same grant and code it in different ways, so it's not 100% precise. But as far as I know, I'm not aware of like one agreed upon definition of resilience.
Thanks, Grace. I think that that's maybe a topic for another webinar.
Yeah, it might be.
Well, we'll continue to take questions, and then at the end of our next presenter's presentation, we'll voice all of those questions. So continue to type in your questions if you have them, or to raise your hand, and we'll get you live to ask a question. For now, we're going to turn to our next guest, Edgar Walters. Edgar is an investigative reporter for the Texas Tribune. I live in Tennessee. I almost put you in a different state there, Edgar. where he started as an intern in 2013. He previously covered health and human services for the Tribune, and before that, he had a political reporting fellowship with the Berliner Zeitung, a daily newspaper in Berlin. He's a graduate of the Plan 2 Honors Program at the University of Texas at Austin, where he worked as an editor for the Daily Texan. Thanks for joining us, Edgar.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll just start off by saying I'm a reporter. Obviously, I'm not here to advocate any particular sort of solutions, but just wanted to kind of give you guys an update of what we're hearing on the ground as we continue to cover the long-term recovery process after Harvey. Obviously, the government, and in particular, the federal government, shoulders the vast majority of recovery costs after a natural disaster like Harvey. But there is certainly a large amount of philanthropic activity as well. And even though the government recovery programs are extensive, there is a fair amount of, I think, improvement that could be made, and what we tend to hear from sources day to day. So just one quick note, we're now, I guess, about 9 months after the storm, and to just give you a sense of, you know, when I say long-term recovery, it really is a long-term process. The city of Houston and Harris County, where Houston is located, are really just now, in the next 3 weeks or so, supposed to present their plans for how to spend the roughly $2 billion that they're going to be getting from the federal government, the Housing and Urban Development Agency. They're getting about $2 billion in block grant funds. And so if you're paying attention to sort of local recovery efforts and what sort of projects they're going to prioritize, now is really the time to tune in, follow those local news reports closely, because before long, I think City Council will be voting in Houston to sort of look at what projects they'd like to be prioritizing with that block grant money. So obviously the biggest expenditure from the government's perspective is on housing, and that's really where the biggest need is. That said, some of the key programs, FEMA's sort of direct housing programs like the Dollar program, which really does kind of limited home repairs for people. As a reporter on the ground, personally have not heard really great things. In general, it seems like there is a high amount of need in Houston and elsewhere from families, and particularly in the disability community, as far as getting assistance to kind of make limited repairs to make their homes habitable, even this many months later. Particularly in the disability community, we're hearing issues with accessibility as really sort of at the forefront. And then beyond housing costs, I would say that a really key area of need is in public schools. We have a report out today from our education reporter that is really looking at how public schools, primarily in the Houston area, have fared after the storm. There were more than 13,000 teachers in Texas who reported being homeless after Harvey. So if you think about the number of school days or instruction days lost just to the storm itself in Texas public schools, but then you think beyond that, you know, the number of lost sort of instructional days when teachers couldn't make it because they themselves were displaced or you know, dealing with their own sort of recovery efforts. All that really added up, I think, to be a really stressful month of May in Texas, with some of these high stakes standardized tests going out in school districts affected by the storm. You know, there was a big need as far as, sort of supplemental instructional time and resources that could be made available to students in order to pass those exams. And now I think going into summer break, we're still hearing that there's a lot of need there, trying to get students caught up, sort of summer kind of supplemental programs, and really meals being another key issue. Obviously, every summer during summer break, hunger among public school students tends to be a big issue because so many rely on free and reduced cost breakfast and lunch. And so another sort of key area of need that we have heard about is kind of addressing student hunger. And then another issue sort of in the school realm is state lawmakers from the Houston area in particular, have talked a lot about just the effect that the storm has had on workforce. And so, when we talk about things like resiliency, one issue facing school districts and I think other kind of public programs is what do you do with a workforce, when, for example, your school bus drivers don't show up to work anymore because they've lost their home in the storm and they've been displaced. Sort of what kind of backup plans do you have in place to recruit and retain staff who are able to, work in the aftermath of the storm? And then the last two issues I want to talk about, first is mental health. I was doing some reporting on a story not related to Harvey actually, but which brought me down to Galveston, which is on the Gulf Coast. And I was hearing from sources about sort of the needs that they had in the community after Harvey, which to me was confusing because I didn't think that Galveston had really borne the brunt of the storm, which was true. But I think it's worth thinking about. Obviously, it's not just the disaster areas themselves that deal with the costs and the difficulty of recovery, but also neighboring communities. So what had happened in Galveston was, while there was very minimal sort of direct damage from the storm, you had a really big influx of families, people staying with their relatives, coming from out of town in the aftermath of the storm. And at the time, speaking with sources down there, I think what some in the philanthropic community were most excited about was programs, again, working with young children, but in the area of mental health. So you had all of these displaced kids who were not, they were sort of ripped from their home communities, not in the schools that they knew, or with the teachers and friends that they knew. And that can be a really traumatic thing for a young kid to deal with. And so there was some funds made available looking at a lot of, there were group therapy sessions, for example, or mental health professionals working with parents to sort of look through the parents' eyes to talk about how to talk to your kid about what it's like to go through something this traumatic, try to sort of ease the stress in order to improve their mental health, because they were reporting there were fights breaking out at school, or teenage school kids suffering from depression and so on. So I think mental health was really a key area of focus, which is not necessarily, when you talk about sort of hurricane recovery dollars from the federal government's perspective, again, most of that is going for housing, infrastructure repair, that sort of thing. So I think mental health was a big need. And then the last area that's really come up in our reporting is specifically looking at low income housing and displacement. A storm, obviously, like Harvey, doesn't discriminate as far as, who gets flooded. But the fact is that a lot of low-income housing, especially where tenants who have a housing choice voucher, what's commonly known as a Section 8 voucher, are renting. There was widespread displacement. There was a lot of, in Houston, there was some public housing that was damaged as well. So what you had in the aftermath of the storm, and what's really still playing out now, is you had all of these people trying to use sort of government housing assistance, to find, a safe, dry place to live and pay with their voucher. It is always difficult for voucher holders to find a place to live, but after a time like Harvey, what you see is the rental market is really squeezed, and so there's not a lot of options available to people. In Texas, it is legal for a landlord to turn someone away simply for wanting to pay with a voucher. There's no non-discrimination guarantee. So what a lot of groups have and what the city, I think, got some grant money to do is looking at using nonprofits to try to sort of encourage landlords to rent to Section 8 voucher holders, using kind of incentive payments to reduce the risk that a landlord might take on in terms of collecting late payments from the government and so on. So yeah, I know that's a pretty wide array of topics, but in terms of long-term needs and challenges after a storm, obviously it touches people's lives in all matter of on all kinds of issues. So yeah, with that, I guess I can turn it back over to you for questions.
Thank you, Edgar. We have 3 questions. One is based on your last comment about incentives to rent to low-income applicants. You mentioned encourage nonprofits. Does that mean that funding would go to the nonprofits and then the nonprofits would use that as incentives for landlords?
Yeah, that's correct. And yeah, there are some sort of structural limitations because of how the Section 8 program works. Yeah, I think it has to be a nonprofit. But in Houston, for example, there is a nonprofit that was sort of, it's not run by the city of Houston, but is sort of an outgrowth of city sort of efforts, but it's called NestQuest. And yeah, NestQuest is really the nonprofit in Houston that's taking on a lot of that role. There's also a similar nonprofit sort of rental sublease program in Dallas that I know of. I can't remember the exact name of it, but it's run by the Inclusive Communities Project up there.
Thanks. Here's a second question. You've talked a lot about displacement, and we know that after Katrina, for instance, a lot of the folks did not return to New Orleans even after recovery efforts begin. Is there any estimate about how much displacement will be permanent and what impact that might have on economic development?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm going to give probably less than a satisfying answer, but I can speak in general terms that yes, there is absolutely, most people predict that there will be long-term displacement, especially from kind of the smaller communities in Texas that were hit along the Gulf Coast. There are big concerns that, many families just won't come back. The schools are likely to be sort of downgraded, right? From maybe you had a 5A school, but after the storm, so few families return, maybe it's only a 4A school and you're getting less funding. I know there's a lot of anxiety about that in coastal communities. As far as actual numbers go, unfortunately, that's kind of an area of debate right now. And in fact, there's a lot of concern that, population estimates in the US, they all go back to the census. And this year, there are a lot of sort of conflicting issues about how do we even get an accurate count on how many Texans are there and where are they living. That's in part due to Harvey. With displacement, it's just made counting and tracking difficult. And then also, you may be aware that the Trump administration has said that the census is going to ask about U.S. citizenship status, which is something new, and has caused, there's a lot of concern that that's also going to lead to sort of an undercounting of how many people are actually living in these areas and how many people were displaced, because if you're asking about citizenship, you know, and not as non-citizens are worried about the repercussions of that, then they're likely to not be upfront about the number of people who are living in the home, that sort of thing. So yeah, that's a very roundabout way of saying yes, but to what extent, we don't quite know yet.
Thanks. I think the roundabout answer is probably the only honest answer at this point. The final question that's come through, we have primarily national funders on this call who may not have been tracking the local journalism reporting efforts. The question has to do there with some story, perhaps early on, about whether the state or the federal government would handle the disbursement of funds, some bit of controversy. If that is an accurate assessment of that story, can you share information about that and if it's been resolved?
Yeah, it's a good question. There is all kinds of controversy at the moment. I mean, I think the best way to characterize it is there's a lot of finger pointing going on. So yeah, we're primarily talking about federal dollars here, but it is the state government that's kind of in charge of dispersing those and reporting back to the federal government about how those get spent. And so in Texas, that goes through an agency known as the General Land Office. And if you're interested in following how the federal block grant funds are being spent, the General Land Office here is a really good resource. They produce these quarterly reports that are very extensive, and you can sort of go through and just check on the status of what projects have been funded and how progressed are they. And those quarterly reports are available online, so that's a good resource. Basically, the long and short of the current controversy is that the state is projected to have a really, really tight budget year in 2019 when lawmakers convene in Austin to set the state budget. That's in part because for a lot of reasons, just the state government has a lot of big bills coming due. They've been cutting taxes, so there's less revenue available. And then, of course, there's also the cost of Hurricane Harvey. So there was a big controversy about whether the governor was going to dip into what's known as the rainy day fund here. It's kind of like an emergency fund that the state government can use. So far, that has not been on the table. The government has really been resistant. But meanwhile, the city of Houston is very much up in arms about that and would like to see some state money being used to draw down additional federal funds. It's pretty complex at this point, but I think it's safe to say at this point there's just a lot of finger pointing about who's going to pay the bills.
Thanks, Edgar. That looks to be the last of the questions to you and to Grace. So now we're going to turn to those of us who are with us today and to see if the funders on the line have any questions or announcements to share with each other. We have one hand up. I'll look to see that question and see if I can get you promoted to attendee here. For some reason, we're having a difficult time doing that today. Hold on one moment and give me a second to see if I can do that. I'm going to ask that the two persons who raised their hands, if they would type in their question for now, since we're having difficulty promoting you to panelists and giving you the mic. Alrighty, Kelly, we're promoting you to panelists. We've got that now, and if you'll, you have the mic and you can go ahead. Kelly, in absence of anything from you, we're now going to turn the mic over to Regine Webster. Regine?
Hello, this is Kelly.
Oh, Kelly. Well, then you can jump in and then we'll turn it over to Regine.
So sorry, I had two quick announcements. Local funders in the greater Houston area are thinking about having a regional funder update in August that would talk about where we are in recovery, what money has already come into the community, but also getting a better understanding of funding in the pipeline, particularly on a state and a federal level. So we're just in the beginning conversation about doing something like that. So if there are funders from Montgomery, Fort Bend, Galveston, and other counties, please feel free to reach out to me. And then secondly, the Simmons Foundation is going to be hosting a advocacy training with Alliance for Justice for grantees in those counties I mentioned, and there will be a funder education session where funders can hear about what grantees have been doing related to Harvey advocacy and what things funders can fund, so that we can start with the baseline understanding and knowledge. And that training will also happen in August. So again, if funders are interested in attending that to get information about what is allowable around advocacy funding related to Harvey, please feel free to reach out.
Thanks, Kelly. And just as a reminder, that was Kelly King Jackson from Simmons Foundation. Thanks for your patience, Kelly, as we got you up and ready to go. Now I'm going to unmute the microphone for Regine Webster.
Hey, Kim, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. I just thought I would take a stab at answering that question around common resilience definitions that Grace touched on, and I'll just add some other thinking to the mix there. There are many definitions of resilience, all of which are grounded in I would say, consistent principles, but the way they get executed is different. So for instance, the United Nations, FEMA, HUD, other governmental bodies, along with other funders such as the Rockefeller Foundation, and then there are other research entities such as the National Academies of Sciences and Resilient US, and that list is not comprehensive. They all have, again, they have their own definitions that are grounded in some consistent, I'd say, values. When Grace and I and the rest of the Foundation Center team and CDP team thought about the definition that we wanted to use for resilience in the taxonomy around the state of the disaster philanthropy report, we honestly made the determination to code it the way that the grant maker coded it. So for instance, if the Kim Family Foundation said that they gave a grant for resilience, we took that at face value and code it, and Foundation Center codes it as a resilience grant.
That's helpful, Regine. Thanks. Any questions for Regine while she still has the mic? And again, that was Regine Webster from Center for Disaster Philanthropy. Any other questions or comments, information, announcements that folks might want to share? Alrighty, we'll move ahead then for today. And again, thanks for your patience as we got that mic passed around. It's time for us to close, and we hope this briefing and all 10 of the others have informed your work as funders. Please share the site for the summary of all 10 of these, where you'll find a written report, a recording, and occasionally slides to support the recording. That's at the Simmons Foundation, Initiative Areas, Hurricane Harvey, and the link is here on your screen and will also be in the report that you'll see. We want to thank Grace and Dave for taking the time with us, and I apologize, it wasn't Dave, it was Edgar, to share information with us. So our friends from Foundation Center and the Texas Tribune, and to our friends who provided updates, and to the Simmons Foundation, who's been our supporter for all of these briefings. And as a final reminder, the written summary and recording of the briefing will be mounted at the Simmons Foundation website. If you have questions that were not addressed in this briefing, or questions about our prior briefings, you can email them to me or to my colleague Sally Ray at disasterphilanthropy.org. It's been great to be with you over all of these briefings, and the Center for Disaster Philanthropy stands ready to assist you as you develop and deploy your resources to prepare for and respond to this disaster and to others that are sure to come. Have a great afternoon.